Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 21st of February 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, Mike Robinson. And we're joined today by Vanessa Beeley. But Brexit without the exit seems to be the important topic.
Absolutely. Just before we came on air, we were showing this from Bloomberg saying UK eyes longer Brexit transition and asks EU to talk dates. And this is apparently a draft text for discussion. So in fairness, we have to say that about the implementation period. And the text says this: the UK believes the period's duration should be determined simply by how long it will take to prepare and implement the new processes and new systems that will underpin the future partnership. The UK agrees. This points to a period of around 2 years, but wishes to discuss with the EU the assessment that supports its proposed end date. So absolutely the 2 year period, according to this draft document at least, is flexible. But also in this document it says that the UK agrees with the EU that a joint committee should be established to supervise the withdrawal agreement. The joint committee should have specific functions in relation to the implementation period, for example in relation to acts of EU law adopted during the implementation period. So again, we reiterate the fact, Brian, that the government intends to make sure that UK and EU law stay absolutely in sync during the implementation period. Yeah. Well, I would argue that they're going to stay in sync after that.
I think that's correct, but the EU is going to say jump, and Theresa May's government is going to jump. That's what it's about. It is Brexit without the exit.
And in the meantime, Brexit related in a sense, this is all about Martin Selmayr, who's on the right hand side there. Jean-Claude Juncker's puppet master, tool, I'm not sure which, could be either way. He's been appointed as the top civil servant in the European Commission. So he has been confirmed at the meeting of the College of European Commissioners this morning that he becomes the European Commission's Secretary General. And of course, this man linked to German intelligence, he's Mr. Juncker's sort of right-hand man in the sense that he was the architect of his rise to power. He served as Juncker's campaign director while he was campaigning to become the European Commission President. What else is in his history? He worked for the European Central Bank from 1998 to 2000. He also worked for Bertelsmann, the big media company in Germany. This is not a popular decision to make him the Secretary General. Some people calling it a crazy move, somebody else saying that they've been left speechless by it. But Juncker, he's delighted. He said we need to have a Secretary General, somebody who really knows how things work in-house, who has connections across Europe and beyond. This, of course, is the same man that Theresa May despises because he was allegedly the person who was leaking documents to allegedly undermine the Brexit negotiations. So there you go. That's nice. In the meantime, Prospect magazine here, speed data. Just how much appetite is there for a second EU referendum? I thought this was an interesting little survey that they've done. Is there a swing to remain, they're asking? Could there be a second referendum? And if so, how would it go? And they say last June's general election not only undermined Theresa May's authority, it also tilted the balance of opinion narrowly in favour of Remain. BMG's data below is typical. In the 6 months before the election, the company's polls never put Remain ahead. Since then, they've never put Leave ahead. However, the Remain lead is far too small to be sure of what the outcome of a second referendum would be. After all, in the 2016 vote, most, though not all, polls put Remain ahead, yet Leave secured a narrow victory. Too close to call is still the only safe verdict. But it was this graph here that I thought was particularly interesting because they're showing the swing between the time of the referendum and today. And they're showing that there's been a 7% swing from Remain towards Leave, an 8% swing from Leave towards Remain. So they're arguing that more people have moved slightly towards, but it's still pretty much 50-50. But the key concern here is that people that didn't vote, they are saying their data shows that 51% of people that didn't vote would wish to Remain, and that only 21% would wish to Leave. Now, they're still saying this is all still too close to call, but this, of course, is going to put more sort of determination, perhaps, into this new Remain campaign, which is pushing its way forward at the moment.
Well, and it's bringing the idea that this is okay into people's minds in general. But if people believe that politics and referendum are or voting at general elections and referendum is the way that politics is conducted, it's absolutely not the case. And I'm going to thank the viewer who sent this to us. It's a Labour Party advert for what it calls community organisers, 7 of them required. Let's have a look. It's the role is community organiser. The salary is 29,663 and 76 pence per annum, with an annual fixed sum allowance of £1,841 and a car allowance of £4,200. 24 months fixed term contract, offices across the UK. And what are they going to be doing? Well, this is the main bit here. The poster holders will be part of a community organising task force in communities, working with community leaders and Labour Party members to build a sustainable coalition to affect and deliver social change. So you think that you as the voter have the decision over what's going to happen in your country and communities, because you're going to vote for the people you want and the policies that you want. No, that's not the way it's going to be, or not the way it is, because behind the scenes you've got these extremely well-paid change agents, community organisers, who are going to mould society into their value system, whether you like it or not. And it's interesting that Labour is up to this. Of course, the Tories are doing this, and it was David Cameron who left as Prime Minister to work within this community engagement field. So this is a cross-party initiative which is there to build big society, as I say, whether people want it or not. So very, very dangerous change agents. And when we've got the non-governmental organisations, the next question is who is funding them. And of course, what we're finding in many cases is that ultimately it's open society and George Soros. So any more information on these change agents, be they Tory or Labour, we'd certainly be very interested in receiving that.
Right, we're going to move over to Syria now, and I've picked the Irish Times here. I could have picked any one of the British newspapers, really, because it was the same story. But the Irish Times headline here says, Syria's Ghouta residents wait their turn to die as bombs fall. This is pretty horrendous propaganda across all the mainstream media. Alistair Burt, the International Development Minister, had this to say: the Assad regime's brutal siege of eastern Ghouta, coupled with escalating bombardment and reports of chemical weapon use, we'll come on to that in a second, that's an important statement, and reports of chemical weapons use is causing unprecedented levels of suffering. The enclave has become a crucible of misery and violence, which is simply unacceptable in the 21st century. Airstrikes, artillery and rocket attacks by pro-regime forces are at some of the most intense levels seen in the besieged area in years, leading to scores of civilian casualties. Over 700 people need medical evacuation, but the regime continues to refuse to allow this. We call on the regime and its backers to cease this campaign of violence, to protect civilians and to allow rapid and unhindered humanitarian access, as the international community has made clear to the Assad regime and its backers. The world is watching, he said. Now, I was interested to see what Amnesty International's coverage of this would be, and here we go. Syria, relentless bombing of civilians in eastern Ghouta amounts to war crimes. So they're pretty unequivocal about this. In Syria, in eastern Ghouta, this is war crimes, what's going on. But they weren't so unequivocal when it came to Mosul, for example, Iraq. New reports place Mosul civilian death toll at more than 10 times official estimates. And so they reported that the numbers were 10 times the official estimates, potentially. But they weren't calling the West war criminals. They weren't saying that the coalition bombing with Western bombs was as a result of war crimes. No. But in Syria it is. And Vanessa, just before I come on to why there is activity going on in Eastern Ghouta at the moment. Just give us your thoughts on the media coverage today, and because it's been pretty obscene.
Yeah, I mean, obscene is a very good word. I mean, this is pure sensationalism. We're seeing, particularly from The Guardian, and I know it's being repeated across all other media outlets, but I think The Guardian is sort of leading the way with the what I call the genocide denier headlines, the usage of the invocation of Srebrenica in their reports themselves, quotes from so-called medical staff or civil defence, which we know to be the UK Foreign Office financed and created white helmets, who, by the way, were meeting with Boris Johnson 2 days ago to discuss Syria. So, it's palpably a British Foreign Office organisation functioning on the ground inside Syria as a propaganda construct, amongst other roles. So we're seeing this unbelievable amplification of one narrative, and at the same time they are consummately ignoring, I mean, they're completely disappearing the civilian deaths at the hands of the real war criminals, which are the terrorist factions who've been embedded into the eastern suburbs of Damascus by our governments, by NATO member states, their client states in Saudi Arabia and in Israel, and they're continuing to be supplied arms with which they are daily massacring Syrian civilians in the huge majority government-secured area of Damascus City. So we're seeing a repeat spin cycle of the West Aleppo versus East Aleppo narrative. And the question that I asked somebody this morning, whatever town or city you're living in, and if you had a number of districts in the suburb of that town occupied by extremist militant factions who, if they break into your city, are going to effectively massacre any minority communities that do not comply with their ideology, would you be asking your government to react against that threat? In other words, to send the military in to control that threat? Or would you simply allow it to continue advancing further and deeper into your city, and at the same time massacring your civilians, your children, your residents on an almost daily basis? And let's not forget that the Syrian government has been for some time negotiating with these factions.
Vanessa, this is the type of weaponry that's being used from Eastern Ghouta into the rest of Damascus, right?
Yes, I mean, and basically what we've heard also in the last, I would say, 2 weeks is the sophistication of these missiles has horribly increased. Now, apparently, what we're seeing, and this is through speaking to doctors, to people on the ground inside Damascus, what we're seeing is that these missiles, they're not like the crude gas canisters that you're looking at there. They're actually powered missiles that when they explode on hitting whatever target, they release, almost like a cluster bomb, they're releasing smaller bomblets that when they come into contact with human flesh, they're exploding again. So we're seeing a huge increase in the mutilation of the victims. So even those that are not being killed, yesterday, 9 people were killed in what was described as mortars raining down on Damascus City. And I haven't seen one single mention of that from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch, from the UN, or from any of these media outlets. So, this is the clearest example of a completely biased, one-sided, sensationalist view of what is happening inside Syria. And it's clearly to be able to precipitate NATO state intervention in Syria to prevent another humanitarian disaster.
Right, now, a minute or two ago, we had Alistair Burt saying that reports of chemical weapons use, but Sputnik here reporting white helmets ready for false flag chemical attack in Syria, according to reports. And these reports are coming from, they say, the Arabic language news channel Al Manar, citing others, saying that the White Helmets group has been preparing for another provocation against Syrian government, that they are reportedly distributing masks in Eastern Ghouta to protect civilians. This is the report from chemical gas attack. The group, also known as Syrian Civil Defense, has allegedly been creating a new plot to blame another chemical attack on the Syrian government. Last week, the Russian Center for Syrian Reconciliation announced that it received information from a local resident that Tahrir al-Sham, formerly Jabhat al-Nusra terrorists and white helmets, were preparing to stage a provocation involving the use of chemical weapons in Idlib in order to blame the government for the attack on civilians. So, this, both in East Ghouta and in Idlib, they are clearly attempting to ramp this up. But for the first time, we're seeing them potentially being called out for these false flag attacks before they take place.
Yeah, I mean, this has been going on for some weeks. We need to remember not so long ago, I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was the discovery of the cache of tweets pre-prepared for a chemical attack. So in other words, all the activists were being directed to that cache of pre-prepared tweets in preparation of a chemical attack. Then yesterday, I believe, there were reports of 3 trucks of chlorine entering Idlib. Into the terrorist-held areas. We've had previous reports again, for example, in Riha, in Idlib, I think it was May last year from memory, of Al Jazeera and the White Helmets preparing to film a chemical weapon attack, and that was rumbled by Russian satellites. So, this is not the first time. It's basically the rerun of the weapons of mass destruction narrative, just in a different format. It's very, very clear. And I think one point that really needs to be made here, exactly as the media did in Aleppo, they ignored the 80% of voices in West Aleppo for the 20% of civilians in East Aleppo who were being held hostage and used as human shields by the terrorist factions. That's been proven since the liberation of Aleppo. And I can guarantee you that will also be proven as soon as East Ghouta is liberated. And I will also tell you that the 80% of Syrians that include East Ghouta refugees that I've spoken to in areas like Jaramanya in Damascus will be 100% behind the Syrian Arab Army and their allies in this campaign to liberate the eastern suburbs.
And so is that the reason why the Western press and media is getting so hysterical about this, because they're concerned that potentially East Ghouta is going to be liberated, and they're concerned about the narratives which are going to come out from the people on the ground once that happens?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're hysterical for many reasons. They're hysterical because essentially they're losing the information war, and they know they're losing it. And in fact, instead of reacting in a rather sober way, they're becoming themselves quite hysterical. And I think that is very clear even to people who've been on the fence for the last few years over this conflict, are starting to feel a little bit suspicious of the media motives. And yes, I think that there is huge fear that areas like eastern Damascus that have been occupied for probably the entire length of the conflict have been a hotbed of receiving weapons, ammunition. In fact, I would almost put out a prediction here that at some point the United States coalition in some way is going to be destroying areas of eastern Damascus and certainly of Idlib. And why it will be destroying it is to destroy the evidence that will be exposed as the liberation takes place. And that I will put that prediction out.
Okay, Vanessa Bailey, thank you very much for joining us today. That has been fantastic. We'll move on now. Thank you. Right, now, USS Carney, according to the US Naval Forces Europe, Africa, US 6th Fleet website, US Carney has joined USS Ross in the Black Sea. They are saying that they've entered the Black Sea. Our decision to have 2 ships simultaneously operate in the Black Sea is proactive, not reactive. We operate at the tempo and timing of our choosing in this strategically important region. By nature, ships are flexible, mobile forces. So that was in the official report. And then CNN took up the story with this headline here: U.S. show of force sends Russia a message in the Black Sea. And the message that they want to be sent, or they want to send, is that this is an effort to, quote, desensitize Russia to the presence of US military forces in the Black Sea. So is this, Brian, to be the new norm?
Yeah, get used to it.
if it is the new norm,
Yeah.
what is the message that Russia will be receiving by this about this from a military point of view?
Well, it's Russia's back door is the way the Russians will look at it, and it's one thing that the Americans say, well, we're going to put ships in there to do a patrol, and then they pull those ships out again. But if the Americans are now moving up maritime units on Russia's borders, this can only be seen as provocation by the Russians. If we turned it round the other way and the Russians were going to put surface units somewhere in the vicinity of Bermuda, which the Americans would regard as an important part of the eastern seaboard of the States, we would be seeing this all over the American and international media. So the Americans are playing some very dangerous games here. And of course, remember that those army exercises are still going on at the moment in Estonia. I think they're coming towards the end. But so we've constantly got NATO and EU troops moved up to the Russian borders, which is clearly something the Russians are going to be very, very nervous about. But the Russians are told, don't worry, this is only an exercise. I think these ships is upping the ante. Provocation. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, well, let's bring The Guardian on screen now. This isn't relevant to what I'm about to speak to in the sense that it's from a couple of weeks ago, but I just thought the headline was so obscene that it was worth putting up once again. It says, who is Devin Nunes and why is he sowing confusion in the Russia inquiry? The reason I put that up is just to lead into the fact that Devin Nunes has sent current and former officials of the intelligence community, law enforcement, the State Department, 10 questions about what they knew about Christopher Steele dossier funded by the Democrat National Committee and Hillary for America, and used in a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act application targeting Carter Page. So that's what he is up to. Most recently, the 10 questions are, when and how did you first become aware of any of the information contained in the Steele dossier? In what forms was the information in the Steele dossier presented to you? By whom? Who did you share the information with? When and in what form? What official actions did you take as a result of receiving the information contained in the Steele dossier? Did you convene any meetings with the intelligence community and or law enforcement communities as a result of the information contained in the Steele dossier? When did you first learn or come to believe that the Steele dossier was funded by a Democrat-aligned entity? When did you first learn or come to believe that the Steele dossier was funded by the Democratic National Committee and or Hillary for America, the Clinton campaign? When did you first become aware that the Steele dossier was used to obtain a FISA order on Carter Page? Was President Obama briefed on any information contained in the dossier prior to January the 5th, 2017? And finally, did you discuss the information contained in the Steele dossier with any reporters or other representatives of the media? If so, who and when? So this is upping the ante somewhat, trying to get some very specific information from various people linked to this this setup. Fascinating. It'll
be interesting to watch what happens out of that one.
Yes.
Well, let's come back to UK, and the topic is Nottingham and its child abuse, and really this is bringing us to the heart of Britain's political establishment. The Nottingham Post is reporting on basically what's been happening around the Beechwood Home child abuse scandal. So that's Beechwood Children's Home in the background. This was the home in which Melanie Shaw was abused. And of course, it was Melanie who was the first, one of the first whistleblowers, who blew the whistle on what had taken place in this home. So the headline there, compensation over abuse claims in children's home and foster care hits 2.7 million. And the little subtitle there is that the average payout is £15,000. So let's just get this into our minds that somebody like Melanie abused, threatened, bullied, some of them raped. Melanie alleges that youngsters were murdered on this site. They're getting a £15,000 payout on average.
And no liability.
And there's no admission of liability by Nottingham. Now, don't forget that Nottingham City Council sold off this site very rapidly, The building was then pulled down and new development took place on it. It was UK Column that challenged Nottingham Police that they hadn't carried out a full and proper forensic investigation of this site. Certainly Melanie Shaw was never taken back on the site with the police so that she could take them to locations where she said that children were abused and that some children had died. The police became very, very aggressive when we asked them why they had done no full forensic investigation. They claimed that they had gone on the site and dug one exploratory hole, but as we say, Melanie herself was never taken back on site. And we understand that two individuals who entered the derelict building at one stage and found that there were still records available in the basement, that those two individuals were threatened by police officers to keep quiet and also never to show any of the video that they'd taken of the records of children that they found. So this is very, very dirty stuff. Very interesting reporting by the Nottingham Post, so encourage people to have a look at it. But let's have a look at some of the statistics that they've come up with. So for the county council, because the city council and the county council had joint responsibility for childcare, the county council has received 259 claims. They've paid out on 127, 31 cases concluded without payment, 101 cases pending, and that little lot worth 2.48 million. But of course, nobody did anything wrong, Mike, because there's no admission of liability. And then if we bring in the city council, total claims received 88, cases paid 56, cases concluded without payment nil, cases pending 32, amount paid 291,963. Now, I can tell our viewers and listeners that Melanie Shaw, who of course is still in prison, is one of those who should receive compensation claim. Not that that's what Melanie Shaw wanted in the beginning. She wanted justice, which was something completely different. But of course, Melanie is still sitting in prison. We'll come on to that in just a moment. So let's have a look at what this gentleman had to say. This is one of the solicitors acting for the survivors, Chris Ratcliffe of Uppal Taylor's Solicitors. And he said this: many of my clients have carried this stuff around with them for over half a century. They've been fighting against what they see as an ineffective local authority and police response. The compensation is, in one sense, an acknowledgement and recognition, but none of the compensation payments have come with an admission of liability, so there isn't even that. So this man is right on the button. He goes on to say this: the councils have heavily defended these claims. Each one of the clients that I represent has felt that things could have been dealt with differently had they come forward and said to the council, I was abused, and the council had said, okay, we're listening, you tell us what happened to you, and we will do a full investigation. We will try and put things right. The sentiments of the clients over the council response would have been wholly different. So basically, the survivors feel, this is the sort of words that have been used to UK Column, that feel as though they've been treated as some form of nuisance issue when they've come forward. And certainly the onus was not on, you tell us what happened. It was on, no, you stay away from us because we don't want to get too close to what you're talking about. And what sort of person would do this? Well, here's one of the key Nottingham officers, Alison Mikulska, Corporate Director of Children and Adults. She says, as part of our ongoing response to allegations of historical, physical and sexual abuse in former children's homes, we have settled a number of civil claims for compensation without admission of liability. A number of other claims are ongoing. Compensation is paid from our insurance fund. So here we are, Mike. There is no criminal investigation. This is also all done under civil laws. And of course, as far as this lady's concerned, there's no admission of liability. So these are just allegations that the council has as lovingly deemed, will pay the odd £15,000 to these individuals to get rid of them.
And it's coming from their insurance policy, so it's not coming out of any council members' pensions or pocket,
No.
So they're not suffering in any way?
They're not suffering in any way, so ultimately the taxpayer is paying for this. So we've got nobody guilty, nobody's guilty for abusing the children. The public are going to pay for what has happened, and we're going to pay, well, £15,000. Your life's been ruined, and what does Nottingham City Council think that's worth? £15,000. It's really quite remarkable. So let's bring it back on to Melanie Shaw, because where is the lead whistleblower on Beechwood child abuse? Well, of course, Melanie is still in prison. She spent over 19 months in solitary confinement, where she has been bullied, threatened, denied medical care, books, toiletries, clothing, visitors, letters, stamps, and many other things. So this is the reality. Why do I think that Melanie has been held in prison for so long? Because I don't think they want her near this inquiry. They don't want her near the national inquiry. That's my personal opinion, because Melanie, for all of the trauma that she's experienced, has a truly astonishing memory, and she is talking very, very serious abuse, including children being murdered, but nobody wants to interview her. So this gentleman has been working hard with some of the abuse survivors, and his name's David Hollis. He advocates for the Nottingham Child Sexual Abuse Survivors Group. They are quite pleased that the national inquiry is also going to run part of its inquiry in Nottingham, although I think there's still many people who are very sceptical about that. On this particular part of the article, there was more statistics, so I'll give you some of those. 782 is the number of allegations of historical sexual or physical abuse that have been made so far. 532, the number of suspects identified. 350, the number of people who've come forward with allegations. 90, the number of, quote, core participants identified for the independent inquiry into the child sexual abuse hearing. So out of the 350 that come forward, 90 are permitted or deemed important enough to go through to the national inquiry. 22, the number of children's homes in Nottingham and Nottinghamshire being investigated by police. 15, the number of days in October the inquiry into child sexual abuse hearing for Nottinghamshire councils is due to last. 15 days. 15 days. 13, the number of people who've been charged by police. And 6, the number of people who've so far been convicted.
So sorry, that's 532 is the number of suspects identified, and there have been 13 people who've been charged and 6 who've been convicted. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
That's a good standard of delivery by the police there.
That's quite some investigation, isn't it? But who is investigating? The police are supposed to be investigating, but at the same time, the council's investigating, quote, and paying out compensation. Well, this is what one of the other barristers said, Miss Gallagher. She said there were decades of abuse on an industrial scale of children in the care of Nottinghamshire councils. We say that the proposals which have been made do not deal with the extent or the scale. So this is a phrase that even the police have used themselves, industrial scale, and yet nobody is admitting guilt, and nobody in the councils is being brought into a courtroom to explain what they did or what they didn't do in respect of an investigation.
And of course we should mention that there are still allegations that children from Nottingham were being brought to London.
That's absolutely true, Mike, and in fact there are many, I'll say, allegations that children were being taken from Beechwood and other Nottinghamshire children's homes down to Dolphin Square. But of course, we're now being told by Westminster itself that no, all of that was nonsense. Well, let's bring in the big insurers, because now we know who's paying the bill. It's the big insurers. This was an article we produced on the UK column back in October 2015. 15. Child abuse, the end for big insurers. And why were we saying that? Well, because if you do the basic sums, these are figures which have come out of publicly produced information. But if we say that 5,000 children are abused each year for 30 years, so a new batch of 5,000 children appears each year, and they are paid £1 million each compensation, which we judge to be a reasonable sum if your whole life had been destroyed by the abuse, that would provide an insurance risk of 150 billion, which is enough to bring down the insurance industry. And so we are talking huge sums of money potentially. And if you read this article, which you can find on the UK Column website, it's drawing on the fact that it was published in the press at the time that the insurers were trying to cover up on the abuse in the North Wales care children's homes by telling local councils you need to sack the officials who are blowing the whistle on the abuse. So what can we add to that? Well, we did a little bit of research this morning. If you go online and look at freedom of information requests, you can see that basically Zurich is the insurer for Nottingham City Council. We tried to speak to them ourselves in order to ask were they running dialogue with the council as to how these child abuse investigations should be run. I called at least 6 numbers of their media team, Mike. None of them were manning their phones, so presumably they got more important things to do. This is Operation Daybreak. This is the so-called Nottinghamshire Police into the abuse, and there's an ancillary operation called Xeris. This is looking at a number of other homes aside from Beechwood, but as we've seen from those statistics at the moment, the conviction rate is woefully small. But I'll list some of the other children's homes. There's Skegby Hall, the Young Offenders Institute Watton, Repton Lodge, Laybrook, Berry Hill, The Ridge, Amberdale, Ashley House, South Collingham Hall, Caldwell House. So this is where the industrial scale comes from, but at the moment nobody in the local authority or county council is to blame in the slightest. Now we'll come in at a different angle and say just at the time when child abuse is beginning to break surface in its full horrors in UK, something very different is happening in UKIP. And this was alluded to a few days ago, that UKIP's finances were under great pressure because a judge had ordered a UKIP MEP to pay 282,000 again after making false allegations against MPs' knowledge of child sex abuse. So the three MPs who took the action were Kevin Barrow, Sarah Champion and John Healey. And essentially Ms Collins from UKIP gave a speech in 2014 where she said, well, in Rotherham, where 1,400 children were abused, these local MPs knew and did nothing. They took her to court on the basis that they said they had no knowledge at all about what was going on, and the judge found in their favour. And so what did the judge actually find? Well, each of these MPs was awarded £54,000, plus the lady had costs of about £192,000 put against her. And before I let you come in, Mike, it now appears that UKIP itself is going to be charged some of those costs because UKIP as a party tried to get in and help defend their MP. So I just thought
MEP.
MEP,
Yeah.
Thank you. I just thought it was absolutely amazing. This is part of a statement from the UKIP treasurer who's saying that we're going to need some help here because our finances are in such a bad place that if we have to cough up another £100,000 for this court case, Labour could take us under. So I just, £54,000 damages each for hurt to these MPs' reputation versus £15,000 paid out of public money effectively. I know it's insurance money, but for lives destroyed.
It's obscene.
It's obscene.
There's no
Mike.
other word for it. It is obscene.
Yeah, it's obscene. And of course, at the point that UKIP should be fully in the battle to expose the child abuse and the covers up by Westminster, they're actually on the raw end having to defend themselves against Labour MPs, which is pretty disastrous, I think.
A huge thanks to our long-time supporter who pushed this through to us this morning. This is a tweet from UNHCR Italy, and the tweet says, "Happening now." It's from a couple of weeks ago. I think it's the 14th of February. Happening now, 150 refugees land safely in Italy with a second UNHCR evacuation flight from Libya. And this was the first time we'd heard about flights from Libya, Brian, because obviously we've heard about refugee sailings, attempts to bring refugees across from Libya and North Africa to the European continent on boats. Here is the press release. It's in Italian, but it basically says this: UNHCR evacuates over 1,000 refugees from Libya since November. UNHCR, the UN Agency for Refugees, has evacuated more than 1,000 highly vulnerable refugees from Libya and is identifying lasting solutions for them in third countries. On Tuesday, a flight brought 128 refugees from Tripoli into Niger. And yesterday, on Wednesday the 14th, so this is going back a couple of weeks, as I say, with the second flight, 150 refugees arrived in Rome from Tripoli. Thus, a total of 1,084 refugees have been evacuated from the start of the UNHCR operations over the last 3 months. They've got a quote here from Vincent Cockatell, who's the Special Envoy for the Central Mediterranean. He says these evacuations have brought new hope to the lives of over 1,000 refugees who were detained in Libya in extreme suffering. By the end of 2018, we hope to evacuate at least another 1,000. And amongst the 150 extremely vulnerable refugees, they say, evacuated yesterday from Tripoli to Rome, there were women and children who had been in detention for long periods of time. UNHCR is very proud of what they're doing in this regard. They've got a refugees media website where they post all kinds of nice videos about these people being moved to their new locations and being looked after. But according to this parallel UNHCR report, which is entitled Over 1,000 Refugees Evacuated out of Libya by UNHCR, it says, with the cooperation of UNHCR's partners and thanks to the crucial support of the government of Niger, the 128 refugees evacuated to Niger on Tuesday, 13th of February, are being accommodated in guest houses where assistance and psychological support are made available, pending resettlement or other durable solutions. So far, 770 refugees have been evacuated to Niger, including single mothers, families, and unaccompanied and separated children. So the question that I don't know the answer to at this point, and perhaps some of our viewers might like to help with that, is who are the UNHCR's partners in this case? NGOs, other United Nations bodies. I think we've identified the other UN bodies that are involved, but we'd like to know a bit more about the NGOs that are involved in this, because it seems to be building into an industry. And let's have a look at the sort of scale of the industry here. According to this is their figures at a glance. An unprecedented 65.6 million people around the world have been forced from home, among them nearly 22.5 million refugees, over half of whom are under the age of 18. There are also 10 million stateless people who have been denied a nationality and access to basic rights such as education, healthcare, employment and freedom of movement. And they say that in a world where nearly 20 people are forcibly displaced every minute as a result of conflict or persecution, our work at UNHCR is more important than ever before. The comment that's been made to us is that there are certainly an increasing number of people and a lot of money involved in the refugee crisis, which we know has been orchestrated to a large extent. And of course, that's absolutely right, isn't it? Because we are generating many of the conflicts around the world that are causing these mass movements of people.
And the mass movement is required to break down nation states, and the breakdown of the nation states is needed as a key stepping stone to the world government system of super states, supranational states. Let's just remind ourselves of the analysis we did on the Conservative Party. Of course, if we say who really runs the Conservative Party, we have to look at the bottom left-hand corner of this diagram, which is powerful Conservative lobbyists and the big funders. So those who put in the money control the party. And then, of course, the people who are ultimately controlling the politicians are the whips. And we've pointed out that Gavin Williamson, whip in his own right, but we've also repeatedly focused on the words of Tory whip Tim Fortescue from 1973-74 era, who said that MPs came to him and his colleagues in the whip's office with problems which included little boys, but this was fixed, this was sorted out so that those MPs would do as we asked. You can see that on BBC film footage. So the Tory party openly admitting it used blackmail relating to the abuse of small boys, at least, in order to make sure that the party machinery continued to function. We certainly believe that the same system is working today, and this is why we see a constant refusal by the government for a full, proper and transparent investigation into the industrial scale child abuse in UK. And we'll end with this Telegraph article, which is Eileen Fairweather, but the headline is "Survivors of Child Abuse Deserve Better Than Yet Another Cover-Up." And I think that's a pretty correct statement, Mike. So there we are. Welcome to the United Kingdom. This is the country which stands on the world stage in the United Nations or European Union, or indeed in the United States of America, telling other countries how to run their societies, how to run their politics. But when we start to lift a few stones in the political system in UK, we find complete filth under those stones, of which probably the most heinous crime is the abuse and murder of young children. Okay, thank you very much for joining UK Column. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.